Now look at here, y'all. Now you're talking about terror. I've been terrorized all my day.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to ask Harry that special favor to play by Willie King, The Terrorized, because we're going to talk about innovations to combat vaccine fatigue. But I really feel from a psychic standpoint, folks have felt terrorized for actually several decades and generations, but particularly in terms of health issues, COVID, vaccines, symptoms, just people's dispute, controversy on the need to kind of protect your not only your own self but future generations. All these controversies, in some ways, I think folks have felt terrorized, particularly for the last 2 or 3 years from a global health standpoint. So I guess I wanted to kind of play that song to kind of to my mind, just communicate the importance of this show today, innovations to combat vaccine fatigue. We're really so pleased to have Dr. Onyema Obuago with us, and Dr. O's been on with us before. Also, Reverend Dr. Leroy O. Perry Jr. is with us, pastor of St. Stephen's AME Zion Church, and cultural ambassador to the Yale Clinical Research Program, and Reverend Elvin Clayton, pastor of Walters Memorial AME Zion Church, and cultural ambassador to the Yale Clinical Research Program. Dr. O, I've seen him on TV, I've seen him on newscasts, he's been in print, and so it's really a privilege to have clearly an international star, and I say that without any hesitation, to share with us for the next 50 or so minutes. He's a renowned infectious disease researcher, and has been the lead person on various therapeutic and preventative clinical trials for COVID vaccines, also for HIV, which we're not going to focus on today, but just this whole specter of human biology, global transmission, disease prevention. What does it mean to have a healthy world? Not just your healthy block, your healthy neighborhood, your healthy country, but a healthy world. Vaccines remain, and I'm very comfortable in saying this, although it is disputed by even some people who are trying to run for president, but vaccines remain one of the most effective ways to combat many infectious diseases. But that depends on individuals, us, you, me, everybody, staying up to date with vaccines and boosters. With current recommendations for flu, COVID, and RSV immunization, vaccine fatigue has begun to set in. I mentioned to Dr. O just before starting the show that I had my vaccine, my COVID shot and my flu shot this past Friday, and he reminded me that it still takes a week for it to kind of be for you for it to begin to become active, so to speak.
I know.
And so separate from previous shots that people might have received, this is a fundamental concern and issue and mandate, quite frankly, in my mind, for people to kind of take real ownership of their health. Dr. O, good morning.
Good morning, Tom. Thanks for having me.
As associate professor of medicine and affiliated with the Yale Institute of Global Health, it's always such a pleasure to kind of to see you and not to say Reverend Clayton and Reverend Perry. It's not good to see you guys, but I don't see Dr. O as often as I should. There's a ton of questions that come to my mind. I mean, a plethora. But let's just jump right in. There is a growing concern. I think you agree that vaccine fatigue has become a major obstacle. It gets people tired of a major obstacle in maintaining immunity in the general population. Can you explain a little bit to our listeners this concept of vaccine fatigue, and if you think it's a reality?
I think that's a very topical issue, and I think it's happening at a time where everyone's sounding alarm bells about increasing number of cases, hospitalizations from respiratory illnesses in general, including COVID-19 more recently. And so I think this is a very apt message for the audience. Now, remember that when we initially had vaccines, we were worried about hesitancy or outright refusal, right? For people who'd not been vaccinated against COVID, not wanting to get the shots. Now, this is a different phenomenon. This is people who probably have already accepted previous iterations of the vaccines and are hesitant to receive more. So it's somewhat of a kind of a different challenge where you're really not starting out with people who don't believe in vaccines or who refuse vaccines, but this now includes people who receive vaccines but are asking, why should I take the fifth, the sixth, the seventh shot, right? We've had 3 different iterations of the COVID vaccine. The initial one was the monovalent vaccine. Then we had the bivalent, where we mixed two strains in a vaccine. And then, of course, there's the updated one for the 2023-2024 winter season, which is a monovalent that's targeting the XBB 1.5, which is one of the Omicron subvariants that was circulating at the time. So I think it's a unique challenge, and we're seeing that, frankly, in vaccine uptake for the COVID vaccine, for example, that even for the latest iteration, that less than 20% of adults in the US have taken that, and that's a huge drop from prior uptake rates. And one other concept I just want to mention is that we're seeing differential uptake as well. So more people are electing to get the flu vaccine. So for those same adults, twice as many have opted to receive the flu vaccine, but half of those received the COVID vaccine. So I think that also clearly shows that some people are just, again, very concerned about having to receive multiple doses of the vaccine, because while they refrained from taking the new COVID shot, they still went to get their seasonal influenza vaccine.
Reverend Perry and Reverend Clayton, I want to pull you guys in almost right now, because there's so many things that come to my mind, and to me, there's just one fundamental question: how do we attack this? But Reverend Perry, what's circulating in your synapses this morning as we kind of begin this discussion?
But Tom, I think that Dr. O is sounding the trumpet for what seems to be a clarion call for all who fail to heed the need for taking the vaccines. And I was listening today, and they were saying that COVID is on the rise. One of the ways they were telling us that, they said they can look at the wastewater. They can look at the new entries into the hospital. And I think people have gotten to the point where they think that this will just go away as mysteriously as it approached us, but it's still here. And we have to be vigilant, and particularly people who have comorbidities, seniors, and people who think that they're invincible. They need to know that it is dangerous not to take the vaccine. And I think Dr. O is here to talk to us about how we can work this in such a way as not only can we take one, but take two, and at the price of one. So I just yesterday I went and got because of Dr. O, my RSV shot, and he was telling me about the efficacy of the shot. I wasn't going to take it. I figured I was doing fine, but when I talked to the pharmacy, she said, it's a good thing you came in, because I think this will help you. She said, people just don't understand that these vaccines are not here just to make money for people. These vaccines are here to save lives and to help people. And you can tell by the news today, RSV is spreading across the South and in our neighborhood. So we need to pay attention to the telltale signs of what good health looks like now and going forward in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. Reverend Clayton?
Yes, last Sunday I was watching a football game, and the running back only needed about 3 yards, and he got about 1 yard, and the rest of the team just held him up and pushed. They just kept pushing this guy, and they kept pushing him until he went right into the end zone. And I said, that's what we got to do with this work. We almost have to lift people and keep pushing, keep flooding the airwaves, keep flooding the newspapers and magazines, the importance of getting these vaccines, because it has not gone anywhere.
Dr. O, reference, and I love that metaphor, Reverend Clayton. Dr. O, talk about some people might feel that they've had the various shots and they kind of had, and now they get to have mild symptoms. Why it still is an imperative for them not to just tolerate having an average healthy life, but going for the maximum.
Yeah, so that's a good point, right? And I think it's probably even more, I know we think of the most vulnerable, like Reverend Perry said, the elderly, immunocompromised folk, which is true, because, those groups tend to have way more of the, severe disease, hospitalizations, and death from COVID-19. But we've seen even for kids and so-called young healthy people, first of all, that many young healthy people don't realize they're at risk for severe COVID because they have undiagnosed medical conditions. We know even in the Black community, there's a certain percentage of people who have undiagnosed diabetes, undiagnosed hypertension, undiagnosed kidney disease. So some people carry that without even knowing, and that confers on them a risk of having a severe COVID-19 disease. But then also other things like, we do know that even those who have mild disease have some background rate of developing long COVID. So, saying I won't get my shots, if I get it, I'll have mild disease. But we're only just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding of the burden of long COVID, how it occurs. It manifests in so many different ways. For some minority of individuals, it's quite debilitating. Like people are having a hard time returning back to work. People are having, fatigue. People are having difficulties even being able to get back to their pre-disease state level of functioning, which are quite significant even for, like I said, for those with mild disease. And I think I love Reverend Clayton's analogy. I think that, we need a little bit of a community approach here where we recognize that even if you're young and healthy and you get sick, you can transmit the virus to grandpa, to someone in your home, at your workplace who's vulnerable. So you can actually be a portal or a vector of transmission of the infection to some other vulnerable individuals. So I think if we look at it from the sense that we all have something to contribute to community health by doing our part to take the vaccine, and then it sends a message that's just stronger than take a vaccine to protect yourself, which is true, but it gives it way more importance, right? And gives us that community spirit, which I think is important to get out at this time.
Absolutely. We're going to jump to the study that you're involved with. Dr. O and Reverend Perry's already alluded to it, kind of teased us. But before I do, I guess we're going to also jump back between flu and COVID, and then your study kind of looks at combining the overall gestalt. But just to drive home that point before we go to your study, what about the flu? Can you explain why it's important to take it every year? Because I think people are still just mystified as to science says that the vaccine needs to be modified every year, but does that mean that the flu virus is I don't want to say intelligent, but how do you explain that to the layperson about why the flu virus changes every year and how we need to combat it?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Tom. And I think that, yes, so you're right. Viruses are intelligent. And that's the reason why, they're quite problematic to deal with. And that's the fact that viruses evolve, which means they change. And when they change, it has implications for the ability to cause disease in humans, the way they're able to evade pre-existing immunity, such that even a vaccinated person from, months ago or prior seasons can still get sick with it. And I think we've also seen that level of evolution with COVID-19 as well, right? Where the virus has evolved over time. So, the strongest reason for having a new shot each year is just that the virus changes, and that way, we of course have waning immunity over time with any vaccine, such that we remain vulnerable to the virus, and that's really important. It's been remarkable with COVID-19 how each variant that emerges had learned to evade the immunity of the pre-existing one and just spread. We're seeing that with the new so-called GN1 variant, but it's all about selection of viruses, right? So if people have some kind of immunity, it makes sense that the virus will, in order to thrive, it has to find a way to evade their pre-existing immunity. So therein lies the challenge for vaccines, which means that we have to keep chasing a changing virus with updated vaccines to kind of restore a protection against it.
And just before we go to the study, Reverend Perry, not that I have ESP, but I could tell, I sense what's cooking on your.
Oh, I got a lot on my mind.
I know it. But the part that we can publicly share, not the the light side, not the dark side.
Well, I was thinking two things. One, that I'm wondering how long the government will support the COVID vaccines because it just seems like that support is waning. And I think that, you know, as if Clayton is right, maybe we need to do is get to our legislators and our policymakers and make sure that this stays in place, because the people who are at the bottom are the people who are going to be most affected.
Mm.
And so we need to work toward that, definitely. And the second thing that I want to talk about, and I hope we can get to it by the end of the show, is, you know, I think it's important for our audience to know Dr. O. Dr. Onyema's he's an infectious disease doctor, and you know, he has a passion for ministry and medicine. That's an odd combination, ministry and medicine. And he somehow unassumingly puts it together so smoothly that you wouldn't even know. But it's like he's got the hands for healing, but he also has a heart for healing that comes from God. And I think that makes him unique and special. And before we finish this conversation today, I want him to talk about the work, because we mentioned it in a sidebar earlier, of his work in African countries. Because it seems to me, when you're in a privileged country and we have the availability to take these and get these drugs and don't, it is just damn near shameful. And then you have people who can't get the drugs and who need the drugs. And if they had them, they would take them, but we're not funding them. It's just it's morally wrong. And yet he struggles with balancing that in his heart and in his mind in ministry. And so by the end of the show, I'm hopeful that we'll give him an opportunity to address that, because I'd like to hear the sermon for the week.
Well, we can go with the flow. We definitely have, Dr. O, if I can impose upon you to respond to Reverend Perry in that regard in terms of the global issues, then I promise we'll come back for the next 20 to 25 minutes to focus on the study, which is so important. But the global health issue definitely is key, and hopefully you're comfortable in talking about that. And even if you want to throw in the fact that as we speak in the Middle East, people are going to catch something with bombs are dropping, murders, sanitation, blah, 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 blah. So this is not an academic discussion. This is a global political crisis. Wherever you look, that's affecting us.
Yeah, I think I don't know. There's so many angles to this, and thanks for bringing that up. But you're right. I think that you know, COVID-19 has really been a lesson in how, you know, politics, economics, robustness or lack thereof of health systems, you know, cultural norms and beliefs, like almost every aspect of life, you know, came together to either drive human behavior, acceptance of science and what's out there, impacted even just, you know, the availability of treatments and vaccines and all that. I mean, it's just a very complex interplay in every environment. And I think, you know, certain things I just want to highlight. One is that, you know, sometimes the parts of the world that are most affected by disease get the least attention. Remember, there was a time where, you know, countries in the West had what, 70, 80%, if not higher, of the entire vaccines that were available, including pre-orders, so that even if nothing was done for many months to come, there were other, let's say, less resource countries that were never going to see a vaccine available. There's still inequities around even probably the most effective vaccines being available in some of the low resource countries where, you know, you have a significant, you know, burden of disease, etc. And no hope for the next, you know, decade or so to have any capacity ramped up in those areas to begin to even develop capacity to produce their own vaccines, distribute those vaccines, and have the system to support, you know, the logistics of making that happen. And, you know, COVID taught us that, you know, trouble in any part of the world is going to lead to trouble everywhere. You know, a good example is monkeypox, right? We saw that monkeypox has always been endemic in West Africa, but got global attention because, you know, a strain escaped out of there, you know, and ravaged, you know, many parts of the world, Europe and the US, and we all had to deal with that. So it's a reminder that our fates are kind of tied as we continue to globalize more and more, and that recognizing that we need to continue to make investments in parts of the world that are struggling because that's where many of these diseases can emerge and then end up being a global problem. Remperi was alluding to important things like we're even fighting in the HIV world, where a very important program that's been over 2 decades, the PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Proclamation for AIDS Relief, which has really been a pivotal program that supported HIV work in Africa. There are issues about it being reauthorized. So global funding for HIV work is threatened. And I've said this before that many countries depend on some of these resources, not just for HIV, but to even build their health systems, which then has secondary and tertiary benefits for all the other other infectious diseases, because you use those monies to build health systems, which can then serve the health of population in many ways. And that's being threatened because of ideologic and political differences here in the US. So it's hard sometimes to be really optimistic that we take a pause to really think globally around the consequences of disease. And last thing I just want to say is, you talked about war. I mean, so those of us who've emerged from places where there's political instability, where there's civil strife and all that fuels the destruction of health systems to a degree like you can only imagine. I'm currently doing some work in Liberia. Liberia is one of the poorest countries in the world, and they had almost 2 decades of a civil war, and you still see bullet holes even in their hospital walls, and just really torn down their health systems. And Liberia had to face Ebola and then COVID-19 and who knows what else is brewing, and faring very poorly because of that interplay between political instability, civil strife, etc., like we're seeing in Gaza, for example. So all these things do matter. Many of them are way above our pay grade, but I think that at a minimum, we can highlight these issues, we can advocate for those who hold the purse strings to really think about the vulnerable, the most impacted. And before we think this is just a low resource country kind of problem, there's a lot of poverty in the US, right? There's marginalized groups. We're seeing even the disparities with COVID-19 and vaccine uptake among people of color, disadvantaged populations. And so we have our own domestic challenges. You talked about the government no longer covering vaccines. We know the emergency proclamation, I think, ended in May 2023. And so now people's insurances have to cover the vaccines, right? And now we start to see that gap between the insured and the uninsured with regards to vaccine uptake. And that's now emerging as a driver of some of the disparities with vaccine uptake. So these are even local issues that we can start to also address from a systemic standpoint to address the needs of the vulnerable and the underserved.
Excellent. I'm glad you lifted Liberia up, and obviously the Middle East, and even the Congo. So people might want to do their little research about the wars that are going on throughout everywhere. Let's jump. Go ahead, Reverend Perry.
Can I ask like the old question? In countries like undeveloped countries like Africa and South Africa in particular, maybe, is the fight being won against AIDS or HIV? Or is it just maintenance at this point?
There's a delicate progress. Huge strides have occurred. I think one of the greatest indices are that we've gotten more people than ever on HIV therapy than ever before. I think globally that number is getting to like 70% or higher, which is incredible, for people with HIV across the world. And of course, some of those successes again have been due to some of the funding that we worry that's been threatened. That's why I call it delicate progress. So yes, there's been huge progress. There's a reduction in the number of new cases of HIV globally. We've learned to use HIV medications, not just to treat HIV, but also to prevent HIV. That's helped as well. Africa has learned so much about how to strengthen their health systems to meet global targets to end the HIV epidemic. But like everything else, progress has been slow but incremental, but is now threatened by unavailability of resources.
Excellent question. Dr. Oscar, let's spend 10, 15 minutes on because I guess love the fact that in spite of the geopolitical challenges, people are still optimistic, hopeful, at least in terms of spending time in the vineyard working on some solutions, some resolutions, some prospects, and you're a believer in the body, mind, spirit connection, but it's just not you're preaching about it, but you're in the you're in the daily 24/7, 365 laboratory of life. Let me phrase it that way. So let's talk about the study you're working on to evaluate the safety and tolerability and of this combined vaccine COVID flu cocktail. Phrase it that
Yeah,
way.
we're calling it the FluVid study,
All
which
right.
so just combining influenza with COVID-19. So I think, we talked initially about vaccine fatigue, right? Especially, this is the first time I think I know of that, in fall winter season, we're asking people 60 years and older to receive 3 vaccines against respiratory viruses. First time ever, right? So you're being asked to receive the flu, RSV if you're greater than 60, as well as COVID-19. And I got to tell you, Tom, there's over 200 vaccines for all kinds of infectious disease in the works. And there'll be a couple that will be, the CMV vaccines. I think we may have some of the first approvals maybe by 2024 already. There's tons of vaccine candidates. So the future is going to be full of vaccines for individuals. And so where we have, disease conditions that share similarities, for example, we know in the, fall, winter, that's the flu season, that's the RSV season, that's where you have a peak in cases. Maybe there's a way to combine vaccines for those illnesses that share what we call a similar epidemiology, because they happen at the same time, they impact, the same groups of individuals. So rather than giving the logistics of giving, 1 or 2 or 3 shots separately, it seems like it's a smart idea. Again, I think it also helps combat the vaccine fatigue. Why not we put these together and put them together to vaccinate individuals? So we've never really been concerned in vaccinology about combining vaccines. I think anyone who knows about childhood vaccines know that there are vaccines, for example, like Tdap, that's tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, are in 1 shot. Measles, mumps, rubella are in 1 shot. Hepatitis A and B are in 1 shot, right? So the concept of having a shot that contains antigen for different infections is not new. I think what we just want to do here is really show that nothing is lost, that, when you combine them together, that it remains safe, both from the local reactions people get at the site of the shot and just that overall systemic feeling, but also to make sure that they're generating the immune responses and we're not mortgaging that. So, we'll combine the vaccine, give them together, and then compare it to getting the vaccine separately. And I think that, the goal is to provide enough information to the regulators like the FDA so that we hope that, I don't know if we can make it by the 2024-25 season, but my hope is that we can do that together. I do know there's also talk about even combining all 3, RSV, COVID, and influenza together as well. And it kind of makes sense, even from a logistics standpoint, so that we don't have to do 3 times less work, right? If we are able to put these vaccines together for individuals.
So Dr. who would be a good candidate for the study? And if someone is interested, how can they get involved and participate?
Yeah, so we're looking for any adult who's 18 years and above to participate in the study. There's no upper age limit, at least for the initial cohort. And then, the only thing is we need individuals who have not received a flu and COVID vaccine this respiratory season. So if you received a cough or flu vaccine, August, September onwards, you probably would not qualify the study because we want people who haven't received the vaccine. So, those are the key things we're certainly looking for. It's going to be a 6-month study, so we'll vaccinate individuals, bring them back 1 week later to make sure that the vaccine was tolerated, then bring them back 1 month and 6 months later to measure antibody levels to see how they do, and then compare to those who got the vaccines individually. As always, I like to say that we always have certain groups underrepresented in clinical trials, which include, usually people of color, Blacks and also Hispanic individuals. So I always try to get word out to the communities that we want participation from all these groups for the study.
And so how do they contact you or participate or find out more information?
Yes, so you can always reach us at our clinical trials phone number. It's 203-907-6044. We also have a website in general for clinical trials, which is help us discover at yale.edu. You can send us an email. You can always Google where the Yale Antivirals and Vaccines Research Center, all our information is on there about the best way to reach us. So yes, we're very happy to take volunteers for the clinical trial.
Thanks. And is there any monetary if not reimbursement, any incentive in that regard?
There's always an incentive typically for all our vaccine trials, typically in the order of between $100 and $120 for people's time. And, but again, we always hope that people want to do studies because, they want to contribute to science, they want to advance knowledge. They recognize that participating studies, certainly benefits everyone, and certainly maybe even the potential for personal benefit. But we are always a little cautious with that, given that this is still an experimental combination.
Excellent. Let's open it up, please, Reverend Clayton, jump in.
During this study, Dr. O, is there any concern about the amount of medication that the person will be receiving? Will it be the same amount of COVID medicine or flu medicine you get separately, or is it any difference when you're doing this combination?
Yeah, so because it's a fluvid vaccine, so the flu in general, we tend to use what we call quadrivalent vaccines, which means that they include antigens from 4 different types of influenza, typically 2 influenza A strains and 2 influenza B strains. Influenza A tends to be the vast majority of circulating influenza every season. B tends to be less. So the study will be looking at mRNA vaccines with, one that contains 2A and 2B strains, so quadrivalent. We'll also be looking at a construct that is 2A strains and 1B strain, and adjusting the amount of dose that we give. Now, remember, the first time we used mRNA vaccines was for COVID-19, right, for 3 trials. So we've kind of learned about how much dose takes us, gives us the right immunity. And some of the studies around the new flu vaccine have already been done to help calibrate the right amount of dose of the vaccine that should be given, because you weigh 2 things. One is how well do people tolerate it, and are you achieving the immunity that you want from giving the vaccines? And so we've pretty much come to that sweet spot, and those are the doses that we will be using for this larger study. But we will be looking at one that has 4 strains versus 3 strains of the vaccine in combination with just the regular booster dose of the COVID-19 vaccine.
Excellent. Reverend Perry?
I wanted to go back to the compensation again. The compensation is 120, and they have to come in 3 times?
Yeah, so the compensation is for each visit, Reverend Perry. Yes, so it's not for the total time. We're still negotiating the final amount, but it's going to fall somewhere between $100 and $120. That's pretty standard amount of stipends that we gave to people who did prior flu studies as well as the COVID-19 studies.
So the total would probably be more like 360?
That's correct.
Okay. It's better when you say that up front, because you confuse us with the math.
Yes, but again, we in clinical research, we don't want, financial, incentives to be a driver for clinical trial participation. So that's why I'm exercising caution with that. Because, of course, people do take time off of work to participate in a study. They travel from where they are to our location. So our goal is just to compensate for that. But I hope that the motivation for participating in clinical trial is way above just what the reimbursements are.
Yeah, see, I think the choosing of the words is also important. It's not an incentive to get people to take it. It's a compensation for people who have to get there and park, or get there and get home, or take time off from work and spend hours. So, I think that's important in all of the research studies that we do. We talked to the IRB about that, and that was one of the things that they came up with. How do we measure what is a decent compensation for individuals in particular research studies? And it depends on the research study, depends on the time that the individual has to give up. And whatever cost getting there and getting back. So they try to work that out. So it's reasonable And it's not an incentive. It's not something to say, if you do this, we're going to give you a handful of money. No, that's not what it's about. And I just wanted to clear that up for our audience so that they can, and let me just take the next leap of faith here and say that for the cultural ambassadors, part of our job has been to reach out to members of our community when studies like this happen. And so what we're trying to do, a new thing now, we're trying to take our churches, our member churches, and when we hear research projects, we bring it to the congregation on Sunday, and then we recruit. We educate and we recruit. And so, Dr. O, I just want to let you know that on Sunday, I got 5 people. And I got the number. I'm going to text it to them today. And that's just from one church. Now, just think if all of our churches would do this, it would be phenomenal. And then those who are marginalized and those who would consider the disinherited would maybe get a chance. So, yeah.
Reverend Clayton?
Yes, sir. I really want to go back a little bit because something's been in my brain since earlier in the show.
Great.
Dr. O talked a little bit about the long COVID. And my thought was, I was just wondering, if there any data that shows people who had the vaccine or vaccinated people versus non-vaccinated people that have this long COVID, or is there any difference in the two?
Yeah.
And the second thought is there anything coming down the pike that could prevent long COVID?
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, in a common sense kind of way, I would say one way to prevent long COVID is not to get COVID, right? Because if you don't get COVID, you can't get long COVID. But that's a little simplistic, right? Because we know that nothing we do is 100% protective, right? You know, but yes, we have seen that individuals who are vaccinated, again, it's roughly about like the 20-something%, depends on how you measure it, less risk of developing long COVID. Another intervention we're seeing that also can mitigate that is early treatment with antiviral. So for example, you find that people who got, let's say, Paxlovid, once they were diagnosed with COVID, also had, again, 20-something% reduction in long COVID. So we're not seeing one thing that addresses the entire syndrome. We're seeing things that chip a bit at the proportion of individuals that have it. So yes, there's value to vaccination. Yes, there's value to early treatment, especially the outpatient therapies once you're diagnosed, to mitigate that risk. That said, we've started to come up with reasonable consensus definitions for long COVID, which is important. But many times these are clinical definitions. They're still a bit vague, from center to center. So that's one of the difficulties. There's a lot of background noise. We're seeing that, for example, people who have non-COVID illnesses also get some long symptoms as well, albeit to a lesser proportion than those who got it from flu. The science is established on that. So, long symptoms are not unique to COVID as a virus, even in the field of infectious diseases. There's a ton of work going into like what are the genetics of those who are suffering from long COVID and how they differ from others. There's a lot of work going into developing what we call biomarkers, like are there, signatures of, inflammatory signatures of those who get long COVID versus another. And then even trying to do what we call clustering of the syndrome. So some people tend to have more, what we call, postural symptoms, like, have a fast heart rate and get dizzy, with activities. Some people have more of a neurologic predominant thing, the so-called brain fog, memory loss, etc. So we're also seeing that long COVID is not one syndrome. It's like different pockets and maybe different clusters of symptom complexes that people have that will have very different management outcomes. So the good news is that the government has put a lot of money into this, and the NIH, for example, has what they call a Recover study. Yale's a site for in many of those cohorts. They have like a general Recover study that does looking at neurologic outcomes and different pieces of the puzzle here. So there's a lot of funding going on for the next 5 years at least for, lots of these longitudinal studies so that, hopefully incrementally our understanding of what long COVID is, what's driving it, how to manage it, and how to improve outcomes for those who have it, will be a little more clear. And again, even at Yale, we have long COVID programs within the primary care program, within the respiratory specialists. So we do have, clinics that are dedicated and receive referrals from, providers out there and, sister hospitals to follow some of these patients to continue to expand our understanding of the syndrome. So some things work, but there's still a lot to learn.
Dr. I'm wondering, I'm almost hearing this for the first time, so I'm trying to figure this out critically. Is it neurological, long COVID? So it is really a function of the brain that determines what we're labeling as long COVID? And is it any way related to social determinants of health? Or is it just everybody everyone is, are there any triggers for us to look at, some historical background that leads us to some conclusions with our hypothesis about long COVID?
Yeah, so we could talk about this for 2 hours, right? So the drivers of long COVID, certainly we know that again, having the virus is obviously the prerequisite for developing long COVID. It appears in some individuals the virus can be compartmentalized in certain organs or tissues, which leads to some of the symptoms that people experience. Sometimes they're viral remnants or viral particles that persist for sometimes many weeks to months, if not years, in some individuals that could still be triggering some form of inflammatory response. There's also the theorem around autoimmunity, right? That's, when the body kind of, due to exposure to foreign proteins can attack its own proteins, right? That's that again manifests as autoimmunity. There's but there's and these manifest in so many different ways. They can be vasomotor instability, like we mentioned, where people have difficulty like maintaining their heart rate when they're exerting themselves. We talked about the neurologic syndromes. So it's a and then of course there's the lung syndrome. Some people get, some lung fibrosis and so have difficulty with exertion, get short of breath. Some people even have progressive, fibrosis of their lungs, etc. So it's not just a neurologic syndrome. There's pulmonary syndromes. It affects many neurologic syndromes. It affects many organ systems. And so like I said, it's not one thing. I think it's a cluster of many things. And so I think part of the work is to tease out where people fit into one of these syndromes, identify what the drivers of those unique categories are, and attack them. So the management, I suspect, to be very different based on what syndrome complex you're presenting with.
Tremendous question, tremendous answer. Gentlemen, we have about 8 or 9, 10 minutes, so that's 8 minutes. So whatever crosses your body, mind, and spirit.
I want to ask Dr. O about the vaccine. This is a Pfizer vaccine?
That is correct.
So, and is Pfizer the only one with this vaccine out now? No?
No. So the lots of companies, nowadays it's how would I say, it's the interesting landscape of everybody wants vaccines. Their startups, their new like biotech, and then of course pharmaceuticals that are going into vaccine research. Moderna has its own platform as well for combined vaccines. And of course there's a lot of work going on in the US and even outside the US. So for now, we are working with Pfizer and their vaccines, but we also working with Moderna on the RSV vaccines as well. So just picking and choosing what platforms we think, hold the greatest promise, and even those that are a little more advanced than others in regards to just their vaccine and development timeline and pipeline.
Dr. O, I have a question. This might sound a little bit off track. And again, as we kind of wind up, gentlemen, anything that's on your mind. But in Tom's world, if I could wave my magic wand, I'd like to do a Zoom call with every teacher, secondary school teacher in the United States that's teaching biology, and to have you speak to them Because it seems to me that if I'm taking if I'm in the 9th, 10th, or 11th grade, 12th grade, taking biology, just to hear the excitement of what's going on in this field and the way that you explain it and share it. And again, some students might be turned off by science, but it seems to me that in terms of solving this problem for the future generations, we want to have scientists such as yourself to kind of get involved. And if I'm a reasonably interested student taking biology in 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, this should be a very exciting time if the teacher is kind of presenting nothing by textbook. This is living scientific revolution that we're engaged in. Am I off base here, or do you share that same sentiment?
You're right on it. Sometimes I think that in the past 3 years, even the lay person has come to learn a lot about, the different categories of infectious pathogens. They've learned that viruses change and evolve. They've heard a lot about immunity, which is, so I think in the field of virology, human biology, immunology, I think just by the repetition and the news and the media and just the different forms that we've used to just keep talking again and again and again about COVID-19, I hope that that's translated to the community IQ, if you will, around, some of these issues, I think at least has grown. And I hope it does translate into people's interest in infectious disease in general, in vaccines, in the human immune system. I've spent time talking with high school students who are thinking about going to college, through working with the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation. And it does come through. You see young people asking very important questions, trying to understand some of the basics of the science behind a lot of this work that we're doing. They express fascination with, having it's almost like COVID-19 has been this real world, experience for them. So we're not just talking about abstract concepts, but they've seen that one person can transmit to many. That's the reproduction number of a virus. They've seen different named variants, so they know that viruses evolve and they change, and the implications of that occurring. They've seen that vaccines can mitigate disease, and have learned about different vaccine platforms and some of those technologies. Yeah, so I hope that we use the word STEM a lot when it comes to people going to college. It's something that, again, we still have underrepresentation of people who look like me, and so I hope that this is a moment. That said, though, it's not all rosy. Even in the medical field, we're seeing less people interested in infectious disease as a specialty, even post-COVID, so that doctors who've done their basic training, who decide on what specialty, cardiology, pulmonology, et cetera, almost half of the slots for infectious disease fellowships, which means specialty training, were unfilled when we did the cycle this year. So part of the responsibility of me and many other people is, I think we need to excite another generation about infectious disease, because infectious disease will be with us, has always been with us, and will only be interesting, exciting moving forward. And infectious disease pose threats to global health and our well collectively as a human community. And not just the diseases itself, but I think there's lots of excitement around the prevention of those diseases that will be relevant for many, many decades to come. So here's a call to everyone. Again, we need more people in the field, and everyone is welcome to participate and contribute to the fight against infectious diseases.
Absolutely.
I think that if Eddie Murphy would try to write a book, that him and Grace could do. You see, I think reaching out to the Yale School for our interns is great. But those young people are really brilliant, even when they come to us. How do we reach those who are late bloomers, those who are in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, all the way up college? How can we do that? And I think that Grace has the temperament and the brilliance, along with her husband, Dr. O, who looks like Eddie Murphy, to write a number of children's books and get us all interested again. Basically from the bottom up, instead of trying to work it from the top down. Wait until the family is in college or in med school. Let's start real early and bring this to the forefront, because I think the information is, that's why the anti-vaxxers have a hold on us, is because they got parents who with them every day who don't have the knowledge of this infectious disease studies, and And so they don't know. They don't have anything to balance the truth. And I think this could be one of the ways and I support you, doctor, any way I can, because I think you guys could really make and I got some people who are working in this thing. Dr. Frencher out in California, along with Dr. Stewart at the University of Southern California, they're both looking at this now as a way of how do we reach young people who failed the STEM, who they say, you just don't make it, so you can't be a doctor. And these are the people who would work at Martin Luther King Hospital, and these are the people who would work at communities, hospitals, and wellness centers. How do we help them? And I think that we can start early with them and giving them the information. There'll be more people maybe applying for that field in immunology and the studies that seem to be lacking, particularly in people of color.
Gentlemen, we have 60 seconds. So Dr. O, I'm going to give you the last word to answer that very simple question. And even just, I just want to throw in about the March of Dimes. We forget for polio, you had the young people involved, the March of Dimes. So, but Dr. O, now it's 45 seconds that you have.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know. The future is going to be a lot about vaccines, and vaccines protect our health. One of the reasons we all live as long as we have, and the reason why we live as well as we have, you think about polio and measles and how even for those who survive that, right, how there could be consequences, right, regards to just overall health. And so I think we need to keep this message alive that vaccines are a critical part of maintaining our health. We need to take them when they're available. And I think that even more aspirationally, we can be involved in the process of developing these vaccines. Reverend Perry talked about reaching out very early. I think that makes a lot of sense to build enthusiasm and interest in what will remain a topical area. Infectious disease will always be relevant. And it's time for all of us to put our fingers to the fire and work together to solve the issues now and those that will come in the future.
Mighty gents, thank you so much. Happy holidays, everyone. And Dr. O, as always, good to see you and work on that film with your wife Grace and the book and the multimedia package. Reverend Clayton, Reverend Perry, Dr. O, it's been a pleasure to kind of commune with you guys. Be well.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doctor.